It was late May in 1973, and a group of friends, 9 in total, walked across grassy farmland, eyes set on the ground, searching for a break in the green field. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for, a hole, less than a metre wide, that descended down into a deep cavern. Peering down into the chasm, they could see sunlight glint off water far below them. The cave, or more appropriately, sinkhole, was called the Shaft, and the group were excited to finally get the chance to explore it. They each lowered down into the abyss, geared up with oxygen tanks and torches, ready to dive down into the black depths of the water. They placed a shot line down, which is essentially a rope with a weight on one end and a buoy on the other, and, once dropped, acts as a guide rope, allowing the divers to easily find their way back to the surface. With that done, they ducked under the water and began their descent, swimming down to a depth of around 40 metres, where they found a formation known as the rock pile. They swam around the mountain of rocks and even explored a little further out, but before long their time was up and they had to return to the surface. All of the divers surfaced without a hitch and decided to get a good night's sleep before returning the following day. Unfortunately, the second dive did not go as smoothly as the first, and 4 of the 9 would not make it back out. Let's dive in to the Mount Gambier cave diving accident. When the group of friends arrived on the 26th of May, they would have found themselves at the foot of Mount Gambier, a dormant volcano located in South Australia. Nearby, a large town with the same name gives visitors to the area somewhere to grab some food and get some sleep before they head out for a day of exploring. And there's a lot to see. The landscape around Mount Gambier boasts many forests, lakes and caves, all of which attracts huge amounts of tourists each year. They were staying at a campsite close to the Blue Lake, an impressive body of water inside a volcanic crater. They pitched their tents, happily chatting between themselves about their plans for the next few days. On the morning of the 3rd day of their trip, the group excitedly got ready, grabbing their scuba gear and refilling their diving cylinders in Mount Gambier. After they had everything they needed, the 9 of them headed out to a nearby farm, where the shaft was located. The cave system had first been discovered by a farmer when one of his horses stumbled over what he first thought was a rock. Upon closer inspection, however, he realised that the horse's leg had actually punctured through into a sinkhole. The small opening was made bigger a few years later to allow for exploration, and the site became popular with cave divers. When the group arrived at the sinkhole, all but one of them, named Joan Harper, got ready to descend. Joan had decided not to dive, and instead stayed up in the field, making soup to warm her friends up when they returned. The other 8, eager to begin their second day of exploration, began the process of being lowered down into the hole. Since the opening had been punctured into the roof of the cavern, and the water was about 5.5 metres below the surface, they had to be lowered down by a winch one by one, and their tanks had to be lowered down after them, the entrance not being wide enough to accommodate the divers plus their gear. I'm sure those that were lowered down first could hardly wait for the rest to join them, watching from below as their friends each descended the pillar of sunlight. Once they had all landed in the cool water, they did a quick check of their gear, and with smiles on their faces, they ducked below the surface. It didn't take them long to reach the rock pile that they had been swimming around the day before, and they again took some time to explore the limestone formation, taking pictures and pointing out things to each other. The rock pile sat directly underneath the entrance, so it acted like a landmark, telling divers where to begin swimming up to exit the cave. They also had their shot line, which, along with acting as a guide to the cave entrance, should have been used to hold extra air tanks in the case of emergency. I say should have, because for some reason the group decided not to do this. After a little while, they moved on to the next stage of the exploration. They planned to swim out to the drop-off, which was at the end of the ledge that the rock pile was on. It would take them much deeper than they had been previously, but they had no plans to go over the edge. They swam slowly through the cold water, the light from the hole in the ceiling becoming dimmer as they descended. When they reached a depth of around 55 metres, one of the divers, named Robert Smith, began to feel dizzy. Having dived many times prior to this trip, Robert was well aware of the dangers posed by diving to such depths. Nitrogen narcosis is a serious condition that begins to cause noticeable problems at depths exceeding 30 metres. If a diver doesn't take steps to correct this condition, for example by using the correct concentration of helium in their tanks, or by ascending, their awareness and cognitive ability will continue to deteriorate until they eventually fall unconscious and, as a result, drown. It can also cause some divers to become overconfident. They may start ignoring practiced safety procedures and engage in more risky behaviours. When you combine this with being deep underwater, you can see how easily things can go wrong. Robert, knowing the dangers, signalled to the others that he was feeling dizzy and then headed back to the rock pile. The remaining 7 divers continued along their original path, heading deeper into the darkness. Once he got back to the rock pile, Robert decided to look at the scattered animal bones lay at the bottom of it, and then headed upwards to the shot line. As he reached it, he saw a light shining out from the darkness. It was Glenn Miller. Glenn had been swimming along with the rest of the group when he checked his air gauge and realised that it was getting low. His sister, Christine, was swimming just ahead of him, and he reached out to tap her, intending to let her know that it was time to head back. Unfortunately, she just kept swimming, oblivious to her brother's attempts to communicate with her. Glenn then had to make the incredibly difficult decision to head back on his own, knowing that they all had the same amount of air as he did, and so they too would be running low. Glenn and Robert swam to the surface together with just a couple of minutes of air left over. One of their friends was already there, and a minute later another joined them. After a few more seconds of anxious waiting, Glenn asked Joan, who was still on the surface, to lower a spare air tank down so that he could dive back under and search for the others. He quickly descended to the rock pile and headed off in the direction he had last seen his sister. Glenn's brother, Stephen, had also been on the dive that day, and I can't imagine how desperate Glenn was to find his siblings, knowing that their chances of survival were drastically diminishing as each second passed by. He swam further than he had initially, to a depth of almost 70 metres, and at the end of the ledge, just before it dropped off into darkness, he found a torch and a camera. They both belonged to his brother. Glenn peered over the ledge and saw that silt had been kicked up down the slope, indicating that someone had recently been down there. It was too deep for Glenn to dive with his current gear, and he had, by now, overstayed his time in the water and needed to leave enough time to decompress. He would have slowly made his way to the surface, stopping periodically to decompress, alone, and knowing that his brother and sister were likely dead somewhere in the water below him. When he eventually surfaced, emergency services had arrived on the scene, and it was clear to everyone involved that they were now simply hoping to locate the bodies of the 4 missing divers. Peter Burr, who had surfaced just after Glenn and Robert, was able to give a good account of what had happened. After they reached the drop-off, they turned around and began their planned descent, but the sunlight that had previously been streaming down from the hole was now gone, hidden behind a thick blanket of cloud that had swept in. This made navigating down in the deep water much more difficult, as they now only had the small amount of light emitted from their handheld torches. Peter stayed low, following the slope below him, using it to guide himself back to the rock pile. He looked around once he got there and saw that 2 of the other divers had swam straight up while still in the tunnel, probably wanting to surface quickly as they knew that they were short on air, having gone further into the cave than they had initially planned. Unfortunately, the ceiling was not a straight slope up to the surface, and the pair found themselves inside a domed area. Their lights moved frantically through the water as they began to panic, unable to figure out where they were or how to get out. Another diver had found themselves near the roof of the tunnel, desperately searching for a way up. At the same time, Peter saw the faint outline of another diver swimming away from him, back down the tunnel they had emerged from. It is likely that they were suffering from severe nitrogen narcosis and had no idea that they were going the wrong way. Peter, unable to stay in the water any longer, was unable to help his friends and instead had to make his way to the surface using the shot line. He did dive back down later on, but was unable to find any trace of the missing divers. Emergency services entered the cave and conducted several unsuccessful searches for the bodies. They lacked the experience and necessary equipment for a thorough search, and so the decision was made to close the sinkhole to the public until police could get the training and specialist equipment that they needed. Despite the police's instructions, however, the owner of the land allowed a film crew to enter the shaft on the 22nd of January the year after the accident. The 3-man crew dived down to about 50 metres and set up powerful floodlights, illuminating the surrounding area perfectly. One of the technicians surveyed the area, checking if any adjustments were needed, his eyes scanning past his 3 companions. Except he had only dived down with 2 other people, and that third person was actually the body of Stephen Miller, floating in the water behind them, stuck on a lip at the very edge of the overhang. The team immediately returned to the surface and informed the police, who quickly had the body recovered, but they were still not ready to locate the remaining 3. It is heartbreaking to think that Stephen was so close to making it out. He had activated his buoyancy vest, likely as a last-ditch effort to get to the surface, only to become snagged at the very end of the tunnel. The landowners, understandably feeling uncomfortable knowing that there were 3 bodies below their farm, and tired of waiting for the police, enlisted the help of a dive team from Melbourne. The team arrived and began their task on the 9th of March. Having the right equipment to explore deeper into the cave meant it didn't take them long at all to find 2 bodies, one atop the other. 56 metres into the system, they had found Christine Miller, Glenn's sister, along with their fellow diver Gordon Roberts. It is assumed that the pair had drowned in the dome and that their bodies had sunk and slid down to their position on the tunnel floor. John Bockerman's body, the last of the missing divers, was found a further 6 metres down the tunnel. He had likely swum downwards due to the effects of nitrogen narcosis, unaware that he was swimming to his death. Christine and Gordon were removed from the cave 2 days later, but it would be another month before John's body would be recovered. The dive team struggled to overcome the effects of diving to that depth and had to retreat several times due to nitrogen narcosis. Thankfully, they did eventually manage to bring John's body out on the 9th of April, almost a full year since he had first entered the shaft. There was some speculation about the group having bad air in their tanks, meaning that the effects of nitrogen narcosis would have been more pronounced. The group had refilled their tank at Mount Gambier, and it was thought that their supply could somehow be contaminated. However, the tanks were examined as part of the investigation, and testing revealed that there was nothing wrong with the air within them. The cause of death for the 4 divers was ruled as drowning. As a result of this accident, along with several others around the same time, it was obvious that more needed to be done to prevent further fatalities. The Cave Divers Association of Australia was created to help with this. Divers were required to have their abilities assessed before they were allowed to access any sinkholes, and this was effective in reducing the fatality rate. The investigation into the 4 divers' deaths uncovered that the group had ignored well-known safety procedures. For example, they had not tied emergency air tanks to the shot line, which itself was not fit for purpose as it was not long enough. It should have extended all the way down to the floor of the cave, but instead was floating above the rock pile. Had both things been in place, the others may not have panicked about their air, and so would have been more likely to find the shot line and use the emergency tanks connected to it. The group had also decided against using guidelines, reasoning that with 8 of them, it wasn't practical and would likely have resulted in the lines becoming tangled. They could have used the buddy system, where 2 divers worked together to keep each other safe, but again, they had decided against it. It seems unusual that they had not followed any of these safety measures, especially since 4 of them were diving instructors. But I suppose they were expecting an easy casual dive, where they would stay within the light of the shaft opening and so easily be able to find their way out. Unfortunately, the unexpectedly overcast weather, on top of the effects of nitrogen narcosis, meant that the situation became dangerous very quickly. Regardless of their errors, they were just a group of friends, excited to be doing something together that they all enjoyed, unaware that something as simple as a change in the weather would result in them paying the ultimate price. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave any suggestions for future videos down in the comment section below. Thanks for joining me for this story, and keep yourself safe out there.